Hello there. I'm glad you're here. Whether you're lying down for the night or just resting your mind for a little while, I want to take you back in time with me. Somewhere distant, quiet, and wrapped in candlelight. A place where things moved slower, where every word carried weight, and where the idea of romance had an entirely different shape. Tonight, we're traveling to the Middle Ages, not through dusty history books or echoing museum halls, but by slipping into the soft fabric of daily life, one breath at a time. I want to tell you what dating was like in medieval times. Not just the grand gestures of kings and queens, but how ordinary people, the ones who chopped wood, baked bread, spun wool, and knelt in church pews, found connection, or at least hoped to. You don't need to do anything. Just let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are. Take a breath in, and let it out slowly. The night is yours now. Let's begin. In the medieval world, the idea of dating, at least in the way we think of it today, didn't really exist. People didn't swipe left or right, or meet someone for coffee just to see how it goes. But that doesn't mean they didn't fall in love, ache with longing, or whisper secret promises beneath a harvest moon. They did, just under very different rules. To understand medieval romance, we have to let go of modern expectations. Marriage back then wasn't always about love. It was about land, alliances, and family honor, especially among the nobility. A union was often arranged when the bride and groom were still children, their futures negotiated like parcels of farmland. But even then, there were hearts involved. Even in a world of contracts and dowries, people still found ways to connect. Glances across a banquet hall, letters exchanged under the table, a hand that lingered a second too long. Among the peasantry, things were a little freer. Not entirely, but more so. Peasant marriages didn't involve grand negotiations. If a man could prove he could support a family, a hut, some land, maybe a cow, and if a woman was willing, they could usually marry with the blessing of their local priest. Love wasn't always expected, but sometimes it bloomed anyway. Still, the church played a heavy hand in all matters of the heart. Courtship had to be clean, respectable, and, most importantly, public. Private meetings between unmarried men and women were frowned upon, even forbidden in some places. A walk through a field might be allowed if a chaperone followed 10 paces behind. In towns and villages, there were customs and traditions, some sweet, some strange. Young men might sing beneath a woman's window, leaving small gifts or carved tokens. Women, in turn, might respond with embroidery, a ribbon, or simply a smile if the feeling was returned. Language mattered. In a world without texting or even widespread literacy, the way you spoke could be everything. Men rehearsed their words. Women read between the lines, and everyone knew that a poorly timed compliment could mean disaster. But not everything was whispered and polite. In some regions, especially during spring festivals, young people played games meant to match them with potential partners. There were dances, riddles, and even mock trials of love, where a couple's compatibility was jokingly debated in front of neighbors. It was playful, yes, but serious too, because everyone watched, everyone remembered, and reputation was currency. And yet, even with rules and eyes everywhere, people found moments to be real. A stolen kiss behind the stable, a shared apple beneath the shade of a tree. It was risky, dangerous even. But that risk, that very danger, is what made the feelings burn brighter. For noble women, the situation was more delicate. Their marriages were strategic, their behavior scrutinized. A noble woman who showed too much affection, or worse, acted on it, could ruin her family's standing. So many learned the art of loving silently, of hiding longing behind lace fans and soft nods, of waiting years for someone who might never return. Some of the most passionate medieval love stories are not about consummated relationships, but about yearning, unspoken love, letters never sent, vows made only in the mind. But still, hope lived on, in the rustle of a skirt, in the polish of a boot, in the way someone paused before answering. Even now, hundreds of years later, some of those feelings echo. We may live in a world of electricity and instant messages, but the ache of wanting, the thrill of connection, the flutter in the chest, that hasn't changed. There's something comforting about knowing that, no matter how far back you go in time, people were still people. They still hoped, worried, blushed, and dreamed. And so, as we continue wandering through the winding lanes of medieval life, let's step into the layers of society itself, because who you were had everything to do with how you loved. Let's begin with the nobility. If you were born into a high-ranking family, everything about your life was watched, and that included your heart. Noble sons were expected to secure alliances through marriage. Daughters were raised with the knowledge that their future husbands would likely be chosen for them before they reached adulthood. Love was a luxury, not a right. But don't be mistaken. This didn't stop love from slipping in through the cracks. It just meant that it had to disguise itself. Maybe it looked like an arranged marriage that, over time, turned to real affection. Or maybe it was the opposite. Two people in love, pulled apart by duty, forced to marry strangers while stealing glances at court for the rest of their lives. Among the nobility, every move was calculated. You couldn't just approach someone and say, "I like you." That could be dangerous, politically and socially. So messages were hidden in poems, double meanings, and coded phrases. You might send a rose, one color to declare admiration, another to warn of disapproval. A lace handkerchief dropped at the right moment might carry more weight than 100 spoken words. Then there was the church, an ever-present force that dictated not only how people worshipped, but also how they loved. Marriage was sacred. Premarital relations were sinful. Adultery was condemned. But, as you can imagine, these rules weren't always followed, especially by those who made them. Priests were expected to remain celibate, yet some had secret families. Bishops preached chastity, but turned blind eyes to the affairs of the powerful. The Church's teachings were clear, but the reality was full of gray. Now, shift your gaze to the middle class. Merchants, craftsmen, scholars. Their world was different. They didn't have land to trade or armies to command, but they had ambition. And in that ambition was room for choice, for love. A merchant might fall in love with the baker's daughter, visit her stall every morning just to see her smile. A scholar might write sonnets to the librarian's niece, slipping verses into borrowed books. Their courtships were quieter, but no less intense. In fact, sometimes they burned even brighter, because they were born not out of strategy, but out of genuine connection. And then there were the peasants, the backbone of the medieval world, laborers, farmers, shepherds. Their lives were harsh, governed by seasons and survival. But even in the mud and cold, love found a way. A look shared across fields. A song hummed during chores. A promise exchanged at the edge of the woods. Unlike the noble elite, peasants had more say in who they married. They still needed the Church's blessing, and parental approval carried weight. but love was often the deciding factor. A man would court a woman by proving he could support her, fixing her roof, plowing her father's land, showing up at her door with bread from his own hands. There were no diamonds, no candlelit restaurants, but there was effort, commitment, small, everyday gestures that spoke louder than words. In some villages, there were courtship rituals. Bundling, for example, allowed couples to spend the night together, fully clothed, separated by a board or wrapped tightly in blankets, to talk, laugh, and see if they were truly compatible. It sounds strange now, but in a world without text messages or long phone calls, it was one of the few ways young people could connect beyond fleeting glances. And yes, things could go wrong. Hearts were broken, promises were made and forgotten, scandals erupted. But still, people kept trying. Because even in the face of hardship, love remained one of life's sweetest hopes. As the moon arcs higher in the sky, picture a quiet village street. Cobblestone beneath your feet. A lantern swaying gently in the wind. A girl waiting near a well, pretending she's just fetching water. A boy approaching, holding something behind his back. A carved wooden charm shaped like a heart. They speak softly, they laugh, and for a few moments the world fades away. It's just them, the night, and something unspoken blooming between them. That's what love was like in the medieval world. Not perfect, not always fair, but always, always human. Let's walk a little further now, into the heart of medieval courtship, into the delicate, nuanced, and often wordless language of affection. This was not a world of dating apps or flirtatious texts. It was a world of patience, of ritual, of learning to read meaning in silence. To say, "I like you" out loud was rare, sometimes even scandalous. Affection had to be encoded into gestures, into glances, into gifts that meant everything without saying a word. Take the act of giving a token, for example. It might be something small, a single flower, a piece of cloth, a ring fashioned from twisted straw or tin. But it carried enormous meaning. A favor given during a tournament might be pinned to a knight's sleeve, worn into battle like a badge of honor. It meant someone was watching him, hoping he would return. And letters. Oh, letters. For those who could write or afford a scribe, letters were a lifeline. They were carefully folded, often sealed with wax and scented with herbs or pressed with petals. Words weren't just read, they were felt, recited in secret, memorized, hidden beneath pillows. Sometimes a single letter was all a lover had for months or even years. Poetry, too, played its part. Troubadours, those wandering poets of southern France and beyond, crafted songs of idealized love. Love from afar. Love that could never be. Love that uplifted the soul and tortured the heart. Their verses helped shape an entire tradition of chivalric love, where a knight devoted himself not to conquest, but to honoring the unattainable woman he adored. She might be married. She might be a queen. It didn't matter. What mattered was the purity of his devotion, the depth of his yearning. These stories were not always true, but they gave people a way to speak about feelings that were too dangerous to name. In some courts, especially in France and Italy, gatherings called courts of love were held, mock tribunals where noblewomen debated questions of romance. Is it better to love passionately or to love wisely? Can one love two people at once? Should a woman forgive a knight who breaks her heart? These questions were asked playfully, but they reflected very real struggles. And they offered something rare for the time, a space, however small, where women had the floor, where their voices and opinions shaped the narrative of love. Outside of noble circles, however, love followed more practical lines. Affection was still real, still heartfelt, but it had to work within the framework of survival. A farmer's daughter might choose between two suitors not just for charm, but for who could offer a better roof over her head, who owned a pig, who wouldn't drink away the family's earnings. Still, that doesn't mean passion didn't exist. Far from it. Some of the oldest folk songs from Europe speak of secret meetings in the woods, of hands brushing in the dark, of lovers caught between duty and desire. These songs were passed down orally, sung in kitchens, on porches, in fields. They weren't written down until centuries later, but they were real, and they tell us this. Love has always tried to bloom, even in soil that wasn't ready for it. There were, of course, boundaries, unwritten rules. A young woman couldn't be too forward, or she risked being called immodest. A man couldn't be too eager, or he'd be suspected of dishonorable intentions. Everything danced along a fine line of decorum and implication. But people found ways, they always do. They met at wells, at harvest festivals, in churchyards after Mass. Sometimes a shared look was enough to light a fire. Sometimes two people would circle each other for months, testing, waiting, building a language of glances and hesitations. And sometimes love didn't need to be spoken at all. It was simply understood. Now, picture this. It's early autumn. The leaves are just beginning to turn. A young man sits beneath a tree, whittling a piece of wood. It will become a comb, a gift, not expensive, but carved with care. Across the meadow, a girl gathers herbs. She's seen him before. She knows his name, though they've never spoken. Today, maybe, she'll pass by. Maybe she'll smile. And in that moment, a story begins. A story made not of declarations, but of shared silence, of noticing, of hope. Love, in the medieval world, was a tapestry woven slowly. Each thread was fragile. But together, they formed something strong, something that could endure. Now, let's turn to the institution that loomed over all romantic pursuits in the medieval world. Marriage. It wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a social event, a legal agreement, a religious sacrament, and often a calculated move. To marry meant more than to love. It meant entering a contract that could determine the fate of families, inheritances, and even kingdoms. And yet, within that structure there were moments, small and tender, where love managed to take root. Let's begin with how a medieval marriage came to be. For the nobility, it started long before the bride and groom were even old enough to understand the meaning of the word. Betrothals could be arranged in infancy. Parents, sometimes even kings, negotiated matches that promised wealth, land, military alliances, or political peace. A noble child's future was often signed and sealed before their first steps. These betrothals weren't mere hopes or ideas, they were binding. To break one could start a feud or a war, and when the children were old enough, typically in their early teens, the marriage would take place, sometimes with great ceremony. Trumpets, feasts, blessings from bishops, and sometimes with tears. Among common folk, things were different, but still far from simple. While most peasants had more freedom to choose their partners, they still had to consider family, land, and church approval. A man might approach the father of the girl he wished to marry, offering labor or livestock as a sign of intent. If accepted, they'd set a date for the banns. A public announcement of the intended marriage, read aloud in church for 3 Sundays. The banns served a purpose. It gave the community a chance to object, if one of the partners was already promised, too closely related, or hiding something. In a world where records were scarce, the voices of neighbors were part of the legal process. Then came the wedding itself. For nobles, it was a grand affair. Guests, music, dancing, multiple days of celebration. But for villagers, it might be a quiet ceremony in the local chapel, followed by a meal with friends and family, wine, bread, laughter, and finally, the bedding. Yes, the bedding. In some regions, it was tradition to bless the marriage bed, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with uncomfortable formality. In certain courts, the newlyweds were escorted to their chamber by guests who watched them get into bed. Symbolizing the union was legitimate. The curtains would be drawn and the crowd would leave. But the message was clear. The marriage must be consummated. The contract had to be sealed. But what if the bride and groom didn't love each other? Well, sometimes they grew to. Sometimes they didn't. Marriage was seen as permanent. Divorce was rare, difficult, and heavily restricted by the church. An unhappy couple might separate informally, but legally they remained bound. Still, love could bloom within marriage, especially among commoners, who often married people they knew, childhood friends, neighbors, fellow workers. These unions, while not always romantic at first, could deepen into strong partnerships, filled with affection, shared labor, and resilience. And then there were the secret marriages. Not every union followed the rules. Some couples eloped, fled to distant towns, swore vows in private, and relied on sympathetic priests to sanctify their love. These clandestine marriages were risky. Without proper witnesses or bans, they could be challenged, even annulled. But they were also thrilling. A defiance of custom, a leap of faith. Love, when forbidden, often burned brightest. The church didn't always know how to respond. On one hand, it taught that marriage was sacred. On the other, it recognized the validity of private vows, so long as they were mutual, spoken freely, and intended for life. So, a whispered promise between two people, said with honesty and intention, could, at least in theory, carry the same weight as a public ceremony. But few dared rely on that alone. Too much was at stake. Still, lovers tried. They always have. Love, even in its gentlest form, is rarely simple. And in the medieval world, it could be as perilous as it was beautiful. Because alongside the songs, the glances, and the vows came consequences, sometimes tender, sometimes tragic. Tonight, we step into the shadows behind the stained glass, into the difficult, messy, and very human side of medieval romance. The side where hearts were broken, rules were bent, and reputations were everything. Let's begin with betrayal. Adultery in medieval times was not just a sin, it was a scandal. For noble women, even a whisper of impropriety could be devastating. One misplaced letter, one unsanctioned meeting, and rumors would spiral. Husbands might seek legal recourse. Families could disown daughters. Castles echoed with accusations. Punishments varied. Some women were sent to convents, stripped of their titles, or locked away in towers. Men, especially noblemen, often escaped with less, but not always. In particularly public affairs, or when political stakes were high, even powerful men could be brought low. Among the common folk, consequences were less about titles and more about survival. A woman discovered with another man could be thrown out of her home. A man who seduced someone else's promised bride might find himself in a fight or a courtroom. Yes, there were courts. Love, passion, and betrayal were not just private matters. Communities intervened. Local magistrates heard cases involving broken promises, denied dowries, or accusations of debauchery. In some towns, couples could be forced to marry if it was believed they'd acted improperly, and if they refused, they might be exiled. Jealousy, too, was a force. In households, among servants, between suitors. It could lead to violence, sabotage, or heartbreak. Songs from the period speak of poisoned gifts, slanderous lies, and midnight confessions. Even those who had nothing else, no land, no power, could wield jealousy like a knife. And then there were the stories, some real, some exaggerated, passed from village to village like smoke. The lady who ran away with a stable boy, the monk who kept a lover hidden in the bell tower, the baker who disguised herself as a man to follow her sweetheart into war. People remembered these tales not just because they shocked, but because they resonated. They reminded listeners that desire doesn't always follow rules, that longing is unruly, and that the line between love and disaster is thin. Let's not forget, too, the role of class. Sometimes love crossed boundaries it wasn't meant to. A nobleman fell for a maid. A merchant courted a lady above his station. The world around them disapproved, but the heart doesn't consult the census. And yet, these relationships faced enormous pressure. A noblewoman seen with a craftsman might be accused of shame. A peasant woman caught with a lord could be dismissed as a temptress or worse. Even if affection was genuine, society rarely allowed such love to flourish. Still, some fought for it, bravely, furtively. They met in stables, exchanged notes through trusted servants, or relied on nighttime visits cloaked in darkness. Sometimes they were caught. Sometimes they weren't. And sometimes they disappeared together, fleeing to start anew in towns where no one knew their names. The church condemned such unions. Families disapproved. But for those in love, the cost often seemed worth it. And then there was grief. Not every love story ends in reunion. Wars tore couples apart. Disease took young lovers in the night. Misunderstandings ended in lifelong silence. The medieval world was full of risk, plague, famine, political unrest, and love was never immune. Letters went unanswered, paths diverged, and sometimes all that remained was a keepsake, a ribbon, a lock of hair, a name carved into wood. But there's something powerful in that, too, in remembering, in holding on to a feeling, even when the person is gone. Now, imagine a small cottage at the edge of a forest. A woman sits by the hearth, holding a simple cloth bundle in her lap. Inside is a dried flower, years old, once bright, now pale. It was given to her under a spring sky by someone who never came back. She still remembers his voice, the way he held the stem. She doesn't cry. She just sits, quiet, steady. Not every love ends in joy. But every love, if real, leaves something behind. To understand love in the Middle Ages, we must understand how a woman moved through that world, how she lived, and how, even in silence, she shaped her own path. Let's begin with expectations. A medieval woman's role was largely defined by her class. A noblewoman was expected to be chaste, obedient, and useful to her family, her husband, and her household. Her education, if she received one, focused on virtue, piety, and estate management. Her future was often arranged before she could write her own name. Yet noble women weren't mere ornaments. Many wielded significant power behind closed doors. They managed vast estates while their husbands were at war. They arranged marriages, orchestrated alliances, and kept accounts. Some even acted as regents, ruling in the names of absent kings. In matters of the heart, however, they walked a tightrope. A noblewoman couldn't openly court. She couldn't chase affection. Her value was tied to her perceived purity. And still many loved deeply, sometimes within their marriages, sometimes beyond them. Diaries, letters, and poems show a longing that feels as fresh as any modern ache. Now look to the towns. Middle-class women, wives of merchants, artisans, and guildsmen, were often their husbands' partners. They kept the books, sold goods, raised children, and supervised apprentices. Some took over businesses when their spouses died, becoming respected tradeswomen in their own right. They, too, fell in love, sometimes with the boy across the market square, sometimes with a traveling musician, sometimes with someone they could never have. Their freedom was greater than that of noble women, but still there were limits. Reputation was currency. Rumors could close doors. And then the peasant women. They were the weavers, the gatherers, the carriers of water and firewood. Their hands were rough, their days long, but they were resilient. Many married for love, or at least for shared survival. Their weddings were simple, their joys small and steady. A dry roof, a kind husband, a child who laughed in the mornings. Yet even they had to navigate a world of judgment. A girl who bore a child out of wedlock might be shunned. A widow who remarried too quickly could be whispered about. And yet they persisted. Some defied customs. Some kept secrets. Some chose solitude rather than surrender. Among all women, one truth echoed. Their bodies were watched, their choices scrutinized. But their inner lives? Rich, complicated, fierce. In letters, women wrote of longing, of shame, of strength. A young noblewoman confessed that she waited by a window each morning just to see her beloved pass on horseback. A merchant's daughter saved every ribbon her suitor gave her, sewing them into her dresses one by one. A widow in a mountain village refused all new offers, saying she had loved once, and once was enough. And then there were those who rewrote the rules. A countess who refused a political marriage and instead became a nun. By choice, not fear. A peasant girl who disguised herself as a boy to fight beside her brother in war, only to fall in love with a fellow soldier. A healer who lived alone on the edge of a forest, courted not by wealth, but by those who came seeking her wisdom. Women shaped love stories just as much as men. They inspired poetry. They made decisions that altered dynasties. They chose silence when it was safer, and speech when it mattered. Their power was often subtle. A lifted eyebrow in court, a refusal to smile, a letter hidden in embroidery. But it was real. So now, imagine a woman sitting at her writing desk in a cold stone room. She holds a quill, pauses. She knows what she wants to write, but she also knows it could cost her. Still, she writes it anyway, carefully, lovingly. She seals the letter, hides it in the folds of her cloak, and walks into the night. She is not just a character in history. She is a reminder that even in silence women spoke, even in restraint they chose, even in constraint they loved. And now we arrive at the quiet end of our journey. The torches have dimmed, the halls are still. The music that once filled the air with laughter has faded into memory. All that remains is the hush of night and the echo of stories softly told. You've traveled far with me tonight, through castles and cottages, through letters never sent and promises made beneath moonlight. You've met poets and peasants, ladies and laborers, and for a moment you stood beside them in their hopes and fears, their rituals and longing. What lingers now is this: love, true, aching, inconvenient, stubborn love, has always been with us. The medieval world may seem distant, filled with rigid customs and old stone walls. But look closer, and you'll see yourself. in the young knight who carries a ribbon into battle, in the girl who tucks a note beneath her apron, in the widow who whispers her husband's name before sleep. We like to imagine that our age invented romance, but it didn't. We've simply dressed it in new clothes. Beneath every message, every swipe, every glance across a crowded room is something ancient, a need to connect, to be seen, to be chosen. That's what they felt too, even when their letters were banned, even when their marriages were arranged, even when the odds were stacked against them. They hoped, they believed, they tried. So as your body settles into stillness and your breath evens out into the rhythm of rest, let yourself drift backward once more. Picture a stone path at dawn, dew glistening on the grass. A man waits there, holding a cloak. He's waited every morning for a week, hoping she'll pass this way. Today she does. Their eyes meet. She smiles. He hands her the cloak, and for a moment, time bends around them. There are no trumpets, no poets to write their story, just a shared breath and the promise of more. That's the kind of love history rarely writes about, but it's the kind that matters most. So close your eyes, if they're not closed already. Let the world go soft around the edges. Let your thoughts wander through old streets and quiet chapels, through hayfields and hidden corners. Let the past hold you, just for a little longer. You're safe here, and when morning comes, the world will still be waiting. But for now, rest and dream of love as it once was. Good night.